If you're an HR professional who works hard to fill roles within your company, keep employees engaged, and build company culture, welcome to America Back to Work, where dreams only work if we do. We'll share wide-ranging issues surrounding pre-employment background screening, HR topics such as recruiting, hiring, labor trends, and company culture, as well as broader HR-influenced business topics such as customer experience, service level excellence, and protecting what matters through best practices in prevention, protection, and corporate security. America Back to Work is brought to you by S2 Verify. Here's your host, Arnette Heintze.
Welcome to America Back to Work, brought to you by S2 Verify, where our purpose is to help you hire with confidence and manage insider risk. I'm your host, Arnette Heintze. Thank you for joining. This week, we're going to explore the science and technology of hiring with subject matter expert Josh Millet, one of the founders of Criteria. Josh and his partner created Criteria with the mission to take predictive science and make better, evidence-based talent decisions that drive results. Josh, welcome to the show, and would you mind telling us more about your background and, the driving force behind Criteria?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Arnette. Happy to be here. So I co-founded Criteria about 15 years ago, and our goal, as you mentioned up top, was really to help companies do hiring, do talent acquisition in a more science-based way. So we really started out initially working a lot with small businesses. That was our, that was our initial target market. And over the years, we've evolved to working with bigger enterprise customers, which is now our main focus. So it's been quite a journey. We have around 4,000 customers globally, a little north of 4,000 customers. And I got into Criteria, actually, I had just sold my first startup, had moved from the East Coast to Los Angeles, where we're based. And somehow, I'm not quite sure how, but I got involved in hiring for the company that had acquired us. I was certainly unqualified for that role at the time. And the genesis of Criteria was really a story about me being in an interview and looking up at the clock. I think it showed like 7 minutes after the hour. And it was one of those moments where, both I and the person that was being interviewed, I think, realized it wasn't a great mutual fit at that point, already 7 minutes in. And so that was kind of the kernel of the idea that got me thinking about, okay, how can we use assessments and other tools to do this in a more rigorous way and cut down on some of those awkward interviews?
Yeah. Well, since your company is rooted in science, can you tell us how you validate the assessments that you offer your client base and what's involved with that?
Yeah, there's a number of levels of validation involved. We have a great team of IO psychologists, of industrial organizational psychologists, and they really they own the validation process, and there's a number of steps to it. The ultimate goal is you want to make sure that whatever kind of assessment you're using, and we have cognitive aptitude assessments, we have personality assessments, skills assessments, a pretty wide portfolio. But one thing in common across all of them, when you're validating them, is to make sure that ultimately you're predicting the kinds of business outcomes that you're promising your customers. So those things tend to be areas like greater retention, so that companies that use the assessments will have employees who stay longer, or greater productivity. Obviously, that can take many different forms, right? Depending on if it's a software engineer or a salesperson that you're assessing, right? But ultimately, you want to link it to those kinds of outcomes. In the last 2 or 3 years as well, a really important outcome that our customers are increasingly focused on is diversity, right? They come to Criteria partly because they're looking to build not just higher performing teams, but more diverse teams. And we have some great customer stories about our assessments being used to take a look at talent that otherwise would have been overlooked based on traditional things like resumes and experience, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So under the conventional way of hiring, what are those areas? Why is that coming up short? And how is technology really driving success to managers and overcoming these shortcomings?
Yeah. Well, one of the things you hear about a lot in the HR technology world and the HR world in general these days is skills-based hiring, which we're a big fan of. And skills-based hiring is basically coming to the fore because of, I think, a growing recognition on the part of people who are involved in hiring, whether they're professional HR people or not, that the sort of traditional legacy techniques that are so core to the whole hiring ecosystem just aren't working very, very well. And the two main culprits that I highlight there are resumes and interviews. And specifically with interviews, most companies do what we call unstructured interviews, and those are really creating some of the problem along with resumes. If you look at what drives that process, right, and companies have been using resumes and interviews in the US for 75 years, right, and not much has changed in terms of how companies use them. Yes, there's technology and ATSs and things like that review and scan resumes in different ways maybe than humans would. But the problem for us is the tool itself, right? If you think about it, resumes are, what kind of information do you typically get from a resume if you're an employer? I would say you primarily get two things. You get a sense of the applicant's educational level or educational pedigree, whether they have a 4-year degree, whether they graduated high school, whatever it might be. And then you get some sense of the quantum of experience that they have, right? The amount of experience they have in the field that you're looking for. And what all the research shows, unfortunately, is that those two things, level of education and level of experience, are usually pretty weak signals in terms of predicting those outcomes that we just spoke about. They're not totally useless. They have some correlation to those outcomes, but they're pretty weak when you compare them to some other things that are reasonably easy to assess. So, and that's really what's behind the rise of skills-based hiring, is focusing on the capabilities and the skills that an applicant has, not the means by which they acquired them. And that's why you're seeing like a really big backlash, for example, against degree requirements, right? And it's especially important, I think, to understand why degree requirements can exclude some really qualified candidates and really shut off entire talent pools, especially in the environment we're in, where the labor market is just so tight and quality talent is often so hard to find.
Yep. You know, there's a significant body of research that suggests that traits such as general cognitive ability are reliable predictors of job performance. How can hiring managers identify and measure these traits? Can you give us a couple of tips that kind of fit into this area?
Yeah, well, I'm obviously a little biased here, but using assessments is a great way to identify some of those traits. And you mentioned cognitive ability. That's one where, you know, if you look at a person's problem solving and critical thinking and ability to learn, those kinds of aptitudes translate to so many different jobs. That's why the research is so strong on aptitude being a good predictor of success. Different kinds of assessments can look at different things beyond aptitude. Obviously, personality would measure a whole different set of things. But what all of our assessments, I would say, focus on, and one commonality between all of them, is they look at things that predict long-term performance, right? And so if you're doing that, it really allows you to hire people that have great potential to grow, right? Rather than focusing on, does this person have something that means they're going to be good in the first 3 weeks, right? We tend to focus as a company on those things that are long-term predictors. And you mentioned cognitive ability. It's a really powerful thing because it allows you to sort of cut through the noise that we talked about with where you went to school or if you went to college, and really focus on, do you have the underlying building blocks that make a great employee? So things, again, like critical thinking, the ability to digest and apply and learn new information quickly. Those are things that predict performance, not just in the short term, but over the long term. They're really about assessing potential, which is something we really believe in.
Yeah. You know, I know you've written about how companies need to rethink the concept of culture fit. Can you tell us more about this concept and what are companies getting wrong today, and how can technology really strengthen the workplace culture?
Yeah, culture fit is something that a lot of our customers care about. It's something that is a very common thing that companies say they want. And often it's used in a way that is not productive in terms of hiring the best employees. And the biggest way I think culture fit often creates problems and maybe injects some unintentional or unconscious bias into the hiring process is really through interviews, right? We all want to work with people we like and enjoy spending time with. That's very natural, and I think that's a positive thing, right? But what tends to happen in interviews is that Employers often focus on things like what they perceive as culture fit. How will this person be to work with, right? And often that allows interviews to be kind of derailed by things that are really subjective rather than objective, and looking at, okay, how well is this person going to do in the role? I like to compare it to, one of the things that writers often, journalists often write about in the context of like presidential elections, right? Is sort of the beer test, right? Would you like to have a beer with this candidate, right? How likable do they seem? Which often it's shown really sways voters, right? Unlikable candidates typically don't get elected, right? And in the context of choosing someone to be on your team or to be a coworker, it's very natural, and we should, of course, be screening out people that we think are toxic or somehow going to be, really problematic to work with. But ultimately, how much you have in common with someone else, or sort of how well they fit a sometimes vaguely defined notion of what the culture of the company is often very subjective, and probably should be subordinated to things like, how well is this person going to do in this role? So when we, and sometimes, right, that person doesn't look or sound like the existing team, right, but may really bring different perspectives and challenge the status quo and help avoid groupthink, right? So we like to talk about, with our customers, sort of focusing on culture add, right? What would this person add to the culture? Maybe they don't look or sound quite like some of the existing team members, but as long as they're not going to create friction, maybe we should look at it as, what could they add to our culture, rather than how squarely they fit in a round hole.
Yeah. Yeah. I understand, hiring managers today are really starting to recognize the importance of candidate experience. Can you tell us how technology is improving the candidate experience in the hiring process?
Yeah, and this is really interesting. And we think a lot about candidate experience at Criteria, and it's really changed over the 15 years that we've been running Criteria in really interesting ways. I think, obviously one factor there is, the last 5 years, it's been increasingly clear that we have a labor supply problem in the U.S., right? And so customers and employers are very concerned with creating a good experience for candidates, because they, just on a basic mechanical level, they don't want people dropping out of the process, right? Because they want as many candidates to be considered as possible. But the other thing is, I think, like, as we work more with big enterprises, what we see is that, especially with big consumer-facing brands, they realize that all the people that are applying to their company, and sometimes there's hundreds of thousands of people, right, at big enterprises that constitute like their talent funnel. All those people who are applying to jobs at, let's say, Pepsi or wherever, are also their customers, right? And so the experience they have with the employment brand of the company is also going to maybe influence how they see the broader brand, right? And in that example, if you're hiring people for Pepsi and, only 1 in 30 applicants is going to get a role, you still want the other 29 to drink Pepsi at the end. So there's a big emphasis there. And it's one of the reasons that, we've gotten into new areas like game-based assessments that have a really positive candidate experience, and sometimes delight candidates because they're not used to that kind of thing. The other part of candidate experience I think that we need to look at is the traditional sort of hiring apparatus that we've created through ATSs is often not that candidate friendly, and candidates are beginning to react against that, right? So submitting your resume into what we call the resume abyss and not hearing back is a really disheartening experience, And so one of the things that we've done with our tool is, we create, when a candidate takes an assessment, certain types of assessments on our system, we, and this is something that an employer can optionally turn on or off, but we provide feedback to that candidate on, for example, with a personality assessment, we'll give some feedback on their personality traits and areas that they have strength and areas for development, that kind of thing. And if a candidate's going to spend 15 or 20 minutes taking an assessment, which a lot of candidates feel is, a more fair way to be evaluated than, where they went to school or what they've done in the past few years in the workplace, they kind of deserve some feedback and some recognition of the time they spent there. And and hopefully, even if they don't get the role they were looking for, they can kind of use that feedback to develop themselves.
Yeah. How is technology giving companies a competitive advantage in the hiring market today? Have you got any examples of that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I think that there's a pretty broad recognition among HR people today that if you're not using technology and specifically like data-driven solutions to hiring, then you're really missing out to one of your competitors who probably is using a data-driven approach. But I think in the last sort of 5 years or so, with the rise of data-driven approaches in all other areas of business, there was sort of this moment in HR and hiring where people began to think, wait a minute, we're using data in all other parts of our business, right? Why aren't we using it to help inform our people decisions, right? To help inform who we bring into the organization in the first place. So that's been a kind of a big tailwind for our business, actually, is that people are now seeking out these kind of evidence-based, data-driven approaches. And part of that is a growing recognition, as I mentioned, of sort of some of the shortcomings of those legacy tools that everyone uses and kind of haven't really questioned for a long time in terms of being focused on resumes at the top of the funnel. So there's a variety of different approaches. Obviously, there's some really interesting applications of AI to the hiring process and machine learning. Some of those, though, are also problematic, right? We've seen some kind of high-profile examples of that, where sometimes AI-based systems are, instead of eradicating the biases that they're trying to do, they actually reinforce them, which is obviously a problem, right? There's been some high-profile cases of that, and so when we use machine learning in our tools, we're very careful to use it in a way that is productive, and it's actually quite limited in the way we use it, because our whole goal is to use technology to help minimize bias in the hiring process. I'm not sure you can ever eradicate it altogether, but you certainly can use it to help minimize bias at different points in the hiring process.
Hiring managers today are finding, more and more cases of credential inflation and misrepresentation. And is technology bringing some advantages to that today? How are they helping, discover this?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think, some of the most disturbing research on resumes is that, 85% of resumes contain some sort of misrepresentation or exaggeration. And some of them, to your point, contain like blatant lies, right? And so how do you get past that? How do you work past that? There's a couple things. One, I think, is that employers are gradually moving away from those traditional credentialing processes, right? Like, I think when you look at what's happening with the cost of going to college and the levels of student debt that we have in America, there's a willingness on the part of employers to look beyond the 4-year degree requirement, right? And so we coach our customers all the time that if you really don't need if you can't document why you need a 4-year degree, right, then don't put it in your job description, because you're just excluding 62% of the population, which doesn't have a 4-year degree in America, and so I think that's things like that are really important to focus on. We try to think of encouraging our customers to do what we call filtering in, right? Rather than the existing process that a lot of ATSs work off of is filtering out, right? Okay, you don't have the 3 years of experience, you go in the ignore pile or the reject pile. You don't have the 4-year degree, you go, you're filtered out. And sometimes you don't have the right density of keywords in your resume. Okay, you're filtered out based on that reason. And what skills-based hiring is all about is really focusing on filtering in, right? Finding the building blocks that you need for that role, and positively identifying people that maybe you never would have taken a look at based on their resume.
Yeah. In that area of skills-based, how do you help a company determine whether a candidate that has better skills is a good fit versus the candidate that is really a better cultural fit? I mean, if sometimes that occurs, I understand. So what kind of guidance can you offer companies in that dilemma?
Yeah, I mean, so cultural fit is a really broad term, and companies mean a whole set of different things uh, when they talk about it, I think. So it's sort of one of those fuzzy terms that sometimes what people mean by cultural fit is okay, right? If you know that if you can document and prove based on data that certain traits are linked to success in certain roles, then that's absolutely an approach that's fair, right? So for example, if you know that with your sales team, you've documented that people who are more competitive or more achievement oriented tend to do better in the role, then that's a way in which, quote unquote, cultural fit can be a really powerful thing, and it's okay to use. But overall, what the data shows, what the overwhelming majority of the research shows, is that focusing on things like demonstrated aptitudes, demonstrated skills and capabilities tend to predict outcomes much better in the hiring space. And that cultural fit, on the other hand, often will interject sort of subjective views where if you have 3 interviewers interviewing the same person, they may have very different perspectives on whether someone's a cultural fit. And if that's the case, you're probably measuring something that's fairly subjective. And we want to overall replace those things with objective measures and that's just more fair. It's also more effective in terms of getting good results from your hiring.
Josh, as we get ready to sign off here today, one of the questions I ask all our guests is, if S2 Verify were to conduct a background screening check on you, would there be any surprising discoveries?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, funnily enough, I think I have a pretty good, I'm Canadian, so I have a pretty good clean background, probably from that perspective. But I do recall, when we first raised funding, investors, they do all sorts of diligence. Oh, yeah. And one surprising conversation I had at that point was an investor telling me, actually, after we had closed the deal, so it had all gone through and they had invested in Criteria. And she told me, I didn't know you had played poker. I guess there was a result from a poker tournament that was online, and they had even uncovered that as part of their.
It's funny you say that, because I had a business partner that there was a piece of information about me in a charity poker event, and it caused him to question the same thing. So that's kind of funny.
I had to reassure them I'm not a professional poker player or anything.
Yeah. Yeah. Josh, would you mind sharing with our audience where they can find more information about Criteria, how they can follow you, and the best place to get this information?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of information about assessments and the world of kind of evidence-based, science-based hiring, we have a lot of great content, I think, at our website, which is just criteriacorp.com. We have a lot of white papers there. And even if you're not looking at assessments as part of your near-term strategy, there's a lot of information on just broader hiring trends and things like that there. So that's a great place to start. And then if people want to reach out to me directly, you can find me on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place to find me, is just Josh Millet on LinkedIn.
That's fabulous. Josh, thank you again for all your amazing insights on the science behind hiring. For our audience, please tune in next week for the perfect follow-on topic to today's discussion, from degree-based HR to skill-based HR. How to rethink hiring based on reality, not perception. And it goes without saying, let's get America back to work, because dreams only work if we do.
If you want to stay abreast of HR, recruiting, and hiring trends, tips, and tools, make sure you subscribe to America Back to Work. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a rating and a review.